And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to the live chat. I have two very special guests joining me today to discuss the top 5 toughest seasons of the great Harry Greb. We have Scrapbook Boxing, one of YouTube's just an absolute gem of YouTube, phenomenal channel. Welcome, Scrapbook.
Random, how are you? It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
I'm very well. Thank you for the time. This means a lot. This is a kind of a dream come true for me. We have a power team here, myself accepted, of course. So the other part of the power couple, we have Hardline Boxing Talk, the Boxing Librarian. BL, what's up, my friend?
Hello there. Good to see you. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here, especially on this great panel, including Scrapbook Boxing himself, one of the people I look to, and Random Acoustic Thoughts. Thank you again for inviting me on for what I'm sure is going to be another great chat against my second greatest fighter of all time, and I believe Scrapbook's second greatest fighter of all time. Random, I'm not sure. Do you have him second as well?
I do. I have him second only to the great Sam Langford.
So, yeah, all three of us agree the mighty Sam Langford is number one, but this fight is number two. And one of the good things about having a talk like this on Harry Greb is not only a great weight mover going from what turned pro, like welter to heavy, even fighting heavyweights, is also one of the most resilient and toughest fighters in history. And he's also one of the greatest competitors. A ferocious will to win. It's going to be great fun talking about his 5 toughest years because he had so many of them, and I'm sure we're going to have some great picks between us, and I'm sure it'll be a great discussion.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys found this, but I found that I couldn't satisfy my will to celebrate him properly in just 5 years. It was a little bit like the Langford discussion. He didn't have as many seasons, of course, but my goodness, the work he put in. So I already feel bad about the ones I didn't mention. And I can't promise I won't change my picks while we talk.
That's all good.
So I was thinking maybe one of you two gentlemen kick it off. We can discuss, you can figure it out between you. Who would like to start with their number 5 toughest year?
Scrapbook, would you like to do the honors?
Sure, no problem. It's a pleasure seeing you, BL. Hope everything is well. All is well with you.
Yeah, really good, Scrapbook. Thank you. It's great to have you on the panel, and yeah, I'm sure hopefully all the listeners out there may learn a thing or two about this great fighter. So it's all for the great fighter's benefit in my book, because I'm sure you guys agree. Spreading word.
Absolutely. Well, I have 1922, and the reason why I have 1922, he had 13 fights, 7 no decisions, 3 wins. He had 1 12-round victory and 2 15-round victories. Now, we have to look at something. This was after the dumbing of William Ward, who was Kid Norfolk. And his vision started to become impaired at that time. And if you look at the fighters in 1922, most of them were very good boxers. In fact, the best of the business. He had 2 knockouts, 4 rounds, 5 rounds, twice in February, twice in May. September, he had 3 days apart. The 26th and the 29th of September. That's really amazing. January 2nd, 12-round no decision against Chuck Wiggins. Now, he fought him in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then February 1st, he fought Hugh Walker in Grand Rapids, Michigan. 10 rounds, no decision. February 20th, he had 10 rounds, no decision against Jeff Smith in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, Jeff Smith was the Bayonne Globetrotter. He's very underrated. I have him on my top 10 middleweights. He was an outstanding fighter. And he had a lot of problems with Jeff Smith. He would tell you he was one of the toughest opponents that he was ever in the ring with. So Jeff Smith was on that roster on February 20th of 1922. March 13th, 1922, he had a 15-round victory over Tommy Gibbons. Now, Tommy Gibbons out of St. Paul. He had an older brother by the name of Mike Gibbons. Tommy Gibbons was in the ring with Jack Dempsey. He was also in the ring with Gene Tunney. So that's something that was very, very interesting to me as I researched that. It was a milk fund. It was something sort of an exhibition, but he went 15 rounds with Tommy Gibbons, who was a heavyweight. So if you watch this, he was in there with light heavyweights, and some middleweights in 1922. Also, he was in the ring May 12th, 4th round knockout over Al Roberts, Boston, Massachusetts. May 23rd, he defeated a light heavyweight champion. It was America's light heavyweight champion. That was Gene Tunney, 15 rounds. So, and this was in Madison Square Garden. If you notice the pattern that Harry Greb was fighting in 1922, he was in there with middleweights, light heavyweights, and he never stopped. And he defeated most of those opponents in 1922. 1922 was a very good year. You also had fighters such as Benny Leonard. Benny Leonard had fought Jack Britton, and he dropped him in the 4th round. And had he not hit him while he was down, he would have became the welterweight champion of the world. Also in 1922, you would have Pinky Mitchell, who would become the first junior welterweight champion in boxing history. You also had George Compartier and Balansiki. Balansiki became the first African light heavyweight champion in boxing history. It was a very good year. So that's my year for number 5 with Harry Greb, 1922. I think it was a very rough year. Like I said, keep in mind that he was thumbed by William Ward, Kid Norfolk, and this was in 1921, and he carried the entire 1922 with tough fighters and all master boxers.
Yeah, excellent point, Scrapbook. So obviously, we're probably going to have some overlap here. I certainly suspect that the number 1 toughest season, we may actually agree on that. The rest, I'm not so sure. But BL, would you like to either add anything to that, or you want to just truck on with your number 5 toughest season?
Yeah, first of all, great breakdown from Scrapbook Boxing as always. Now, my number 5 is actually 1922. I chose 1922 for Harry Greb because this was at a point when his eyesight was now getting damaged, and the damage was worsening. This was when he was past his prime. It wasn't until the following year that he'd finally fight Johnny Wilson after roughly 230 fights for middleweight title. He was already leaving his prime at this point. But even despite the fact he was leaving his prime, and during this phase, this was not the Harry Greb who was more the jumping jack-top dancing master who was hard to hit, hard to pin down, constantly on the move, in and out, wheeling you, spinning you with his arms. This was a Harry Greb who had to fight more on the inside and fight up close due to that peripheral vision, depth perception being affected by damage to his eyes. So over this year, his style had already been going through an adaptation from the earlier jumping jack top style, where he was constantly in and out and constantly on the move. But still, he was able to inflict some crazy defeats this year. I mean, in this year alone, he goes unbeaten. Okay, I mean, some people, rave when a fighter now goes unbeaten in 2 or 3 fights a year, but Harry Greb went unbeaten 12 fights, fought over 100 rounds that year, over 100 rounds. I mean, that's the equivalent of like 9, 10, 12 round fights in 1 year. And in that year, like Scrapbook pointed out, he beat the excellent Jerome Jeffers, Jeff Smith, who was one of the hardest fighters to beat. Both Harry Greb and Gene Tunney at different points said that Jeff Smith, due to the ability he had where he could come forward and engage your top body and head, mixing shots up, but then going into that crouch down to his right and firing accurate counters as he'd back off and lure you in. He was a very hard fighter to beat, a very experienced fighter. So any win over Jeff Smith, even this 1922 Jeff Smith, was still a handful. Tommy Gibbons, of course. Tommy Gibbons, around this time from 1920, 1923, he was really in the peak of his powers. He had huge fight runs, huge knockout runs. He, of course, had taken, in this kind of time period, Dempsey. He was the only fighter to take Dempsey 15 rounds in a title fight. He's the only fighter to accomplish that. And like Jack Dempsey said, when they said, what's it like landing clean punches on him? Dempsey said, it's like trying to thread a needle in high wind. That's how hard it is to land clean on Tommy Gibbons' chin. So he also is a very difficult fighter who around this time was really in his prime. And then, of course, we have the outstanding fight with Gene Tunney, of course. To me, one of the most brutal displays against a top level fighter, because Gene Tunney, I critique Gene Tunney a certain amount because he didn't fight certain fighters who called him out, like Kid Norfolk, like Harry Wills, and like others. But Gene Tunney was still a fantastic boxer and still a very capable fighter. And I always remember Gene Tunney said at ringside when he watched Greb prior to his fight with Greb in May 1922, he watched him from ringside, and Gene Tunney said, I don't foresee any major problems. He doesn't look that good. But after the fight, where one writer said Harry Greb treated him like a butcher treats a slab of meat, after he took an absolute vicious hiding off Harry Greb, where he turned in the dancing demon beyond the red veil, he changed his mind and said, he's an outstanding fighter. He did later change that 3 months later into he was a dirty fighter in premonition at rematch, but that's another story. But beating Gene Tunney, who was unbeaten in a half-century of fights, and really on a wave, you know, building his profile, becoming, you know, a more respected fighter all time, following on recently, only a few months before, from beating both Jerome Jeffords and Gibbons' brother Tommy. You know, just incredible run. And also then, of course, he added a win in July against the grandfather of counterpunching himself, the great box fighter, Tommy Loughran, another legitimate all-time great. You know, just a sensational year for Harry Greb, even though he's morphing from his jumping jack top into his more, you know, what will become his more normal style of holding up close so he knows where the opponent is properly so he can deliver a lot of punches. Still a sensational year.
Oh, good breakdown. Can I just add one more thing, if you guys don't mind?
Please.
Yeah.
That was a great breakdown. And to add to what BL just said, we got to keep in mind, this was after the 45 run in 1919. So think of what his body would have gone through after a fight like that, after a fighting run like that. I mean, we have to keep that in perspective. And if you look at all the different states he went to, you know, you got to keep all that in mind. So that was a great year for him. It was a very tough year for a man like that to handle, especially when his eye began to be impaired. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, great point, Scrap. Yeah.
Those are excellent points, gentlemen. Well, we have some sort of psychic connection. My top five, my number 5 toughest season is actually also 1922. I think we're thinking along the same lines here.
Kidding me.
I don't expect, with all the seasons, the great seasons this man had, I'm sure we won't agree on all 5, but there are no wrong answers here. Just what an incredible fighter. I also picked 22 for some of the reasons. I'll just echo some of the reasons you guys gave. One, obviously the level of competition, but also, you know, this was a time in his career when he was having to adjust his style. He was having to adjust to his physical realities. And like BL said, the specific fighters he's facing at this time in his condition, and after all the wear and tear he's put on his body, and he still managed to go undefeated, including at a Hall of Fame level with very scientific boxers, guys who could exploit a weakness, and still, even this late in his career. Because for the uninitiated, I know a lot of people who are on any of our channels, they already know a lot about Greb, but for the uninitiated, you know, he kept fighting a silly level of competition with deteriorating eyesight and physical condition. So as we look through the slides, it's getting harder and harder as he goes along.
If I may point something out, because I mentioned in this period he's morphing through his style, and it was more the later part of this year, because I don't know if Scrapbook said these same stories, but I were doing a lot of research into this, and like Scrapbook said, he suffered, you know, a battery of eye damage in the second Kid Norfolk fight. But I found fight reports regarding a fight on this year, and you'll see if you look towards the bottom, it's October against Larry Williams, where actually some people say, some of the fight reporters said that Larry Williams actually eye gouged Greb in that very same eye that he would later lose his vision in. And they said his eye looked very badly impaired after that, thumbing in the eye. And some people, you know, actually say that, yeah, the damage was made worse by the Kid Norfolk fight, what would have brutal fest the second fight. You know, interestingly, some people say inspired by Kid Norfolk in the tactics, and Harry Greb were just happy to say, yeah, you want to fight, we'll have a fight. Yeah, I love both those guys, real warriors. But a number of people I've spoke to say the actual damage started to occur in final part of this year after the Larry Williams fight. I don't know if Scrapbook's heard any of those stories.
Yeah, Larry Williams, they called him Larry One Punch Williams. And I did hear that. I didn't get any confirmation from that, but I definitely heard that plenty of times. So you could be right on, BL. You could be, because I have heard that before. I have.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Scrap. But we, like say, we don't know if it's 100% true, but yeah, it's an interesting point. Interesting point.
Interesting, gentlemen. So, Scrap, would you like to hit us with your number 4 toughest season for the great Harry Greb?
Sure. It's probably going to be different than you guys. Mine is 1924. And the reason why I'm going to say that is because If you look at the fighters he fought, and once again, we got to go after 1921. What has happened to him? 1922, he was in the ring with Gene Tunney. That had to take a lot out of him, although he cut Gene Tunney to ribbons, but it took a lot out of him as well. And then the next year in 23, he would become the middleweight champion of the world when he would defeat Johnny Wilson. But 1924, he was in there with fighters such as Ted Moore, Tiger Flowers, Jimmy Slattery, Frank Moody, Jackie Clark, Kid Norfolk. So he was in there with some tough guys. He was also in there, I think he gave rematch to Johnny Wilson that year. He was in there with Tommy Loughlin was 1923. But 24 was very tough because he was moving around from Ohio to Cincinnati to New York, and that's got to take a lot out of you. So I have him as 1924 being number 4, the toughest year of his career. A lot of tough fighters that year, and the circumstances was extreme for him during that year.
Yeah, those are great points. BL, would you like to add to that, or would you like to move to your number 5? We can always come back later and recap.
Yeah, no, I agree with Scrapbook for reasons said. And I think Scrapbook is a few times highlighted a very good point in relation to Harry Greb that some people don't give him credit for, and that is the travel during each year, because this was at a time before, you know, you could jump on at LAX and get a 6-hour flight and you're at the other side of the country or halfway across the country. You know, this were in time of steam trains. This were in time of early basic cars that probably wouldn't be able to do a 100-mile journey, much less a 50-mile journey. So I think that is another very good point. It's a point I've made before on Langford and Janetta McVeigh, who fought in Cuba and Australia and Europe, you know, Paris and England. You know, they don't get enough credit for the traveling. You know, many fighters get a lot of credit now for traveling, you know, like Usyk gets all this credit for traveling and fighting abroad, and other fighters have got all this credit for traveling abroad, but these guys never really get credited that. So it's been really great to hear Scrapbook, you know, hit that point home by reinforcing it, that many of these guys really did travel a lot, and they had to travel sometimes huge distances between fights. You know, Harry Greb, sometimes he'd go to a city, there'd be 2 or 3 fighters in that area, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand when they look at a fighter like Harry Greb, and Scrapbook will know what I'm talking about. But sometimes he would go to a city and he would challenge all the best fighters in that city. He may stay there a week or 2. Thus, in some parts of his career, when you look, he'll have a number of fights in the same kind of region, the same kind of area or suburbs or outskirts before moving on. And he's doing that because, you know, he doesn't have the money to afford to travel this way, that way, west and east for fights. So he's traveling around country regionally and fighting the best fighters. But then over the year, he's amassing a lot of what we could call air miles, travel miles. He's traveling a lot. And yeah, I think that's a really important point that Scrapbook's nailed, that Harry Greb doesn't get enough credit for the amount he traveled around and all the different cities and venues he fought in during each average year in his insane career.
Fascinating. So you did indeed, you also picked 24.
No, I will say my number 4. Okay. You know, I mean, 24 is a great year. But actually, I picked 1925. I actually picked 1925. Now, the reason I picked 1925, this was not his best year for fighting Hall of Famers. This was not his best year for beating champions. This was not the year where he fought most rounds in his career, but he did fight over 220 rounds this year. Now, this is a Harry Greb just prior to his retirement, you know, just basically prior to his, not long before his retirement. So to have the huge career he's had, as Scrapbook mentioned earlier, you know, 1 year was after the 1919 year, and all those fights he had, fighting men across different weights. Even so late on in his career, to have a run where he goes 24 wins and only 1 loss, fighting over 200 rounds, nearly the equivalent of 19 12-round fights when you collate those rounds together in just 1 year. That averages more than a 12-round fight per year, per month in terms of rounds fought. Not his greatest year in terms of wins, but I also picked it because he did fight a lot of tough contenders in that year. He also punctuated it. Okay, there was the loss to Gene Tunney earlier in the year in March, but then he did score those 2 great wins. Okay, one over the toy bulldog Mickey Walker, which even to this day is still raved as one of great middleweight title fights. You know, the onlookers who were there were mouth abreast. I mean, it were an incredible battle. Walker were busy over the first 4 or 5 rounds, landing lots of body shots, trying to hook Greb into submission. Greb were fighting in spurts early on. By this time, as he used to do, because sometimes he'd fall behind in rounds, or he'd come out and he'd have a quiet 2 rounds, and then he'd go on a spurt in 3 and slam dunk it and win it clearly, and then he'd have a quiet round, then he'd have a spurt for 2 or 3 more. And sometimes he'd do it where he'd be quiet in the first 4 or 5 rounds of a 15-round fight, but then he'd go into fast mode for the last 10 rounds, because he no longer, by this time in 1925, he could no longer maintain the dizzying pace he became famous for when he was younger, 4 or 5 years earlier. So he were fighting more in close, more inside fighting because of his depth perception going. And then also he was aging. He was more battle worn. You know, so having a year like this with the opposition he fought is quite incredible, considering it's right near the end of his career, and he's still not suffering many defeats. One thing, when you look at Harry Greb's career, a lot of years he suffers very, very few defeats. In fact, in these 5 years I've got here, Harry Greb has only lost 5 times in 5 years. In the years that I will cover, that we're highlighting now on my top 5. So that's 5 times in 5 years where he has over 100 fights in those years. You know, so near end of his career, you know, he beats Mickey Walker and Rosenblum. Rosenblum is a top 10 all-time fighter to me. Mickey Walker's a top 50 all-time fighter to me. He loses to Gene Tunney, of course, but this is a Gene Tunney who's now heavyweight. Okay, Harry Greb is now giving away much more weight in his fight with Gene Tunney than he was in 1922. Gene Tunney is fully fleshing out. You know, he's been fighting European heavyweight champions. He's been fighting other heavyweights. So Gene Tunney is now flushed out into a between 185, 195 pound heavyweight by this time, around that area. Harry Greb is still fighting just a bit above the middleweight limit by this time. You know, so fantastic year, 1925. Just for the fact that he's now well past his prime, but he's still capable of beating future Hall of Famers. He's still capable of beating multiple top contenders and tough fighters, you know, while being past his prime.
Yeah, that was great, PL. Oh, I'm sorry, Random. I just wanted to congratulate him. That was actually, when I take a second look at it, that was a great breakdown. And thank you for the compliment on my end. But 1925 was a great year. He fought Mickey Walker and Johnny Wilson. He was also in the ring with Gene Tunney. I mean, there's a guy by the name of Young Fisher. You look him up. He was very underrated as well. He was a very good, he knew the tricks of the trade. He knew the tricks of the trade.
He was a customer. Yeah.
Absolutely. Soldier Buck. I mean, these are really good fighters. So that's a tough run. So you know what? I like that. I like 1925. That's a great pick. Great pick.
Yeah, thank you, Scrapbook.
Yeah, I agree completely. And in fact, I do agree. I picked, for some of the same reasons, I picked 1925. Oh, hold on, I've got my wrong number up here on the ticker. There we go. So I picked 25. I think I felt like when he's getting this far on in his career, in his physical condition, and he's still facing a ridiculous both speed of schedule, but also strength of schedule and giving up size. I mean, it's one thing to give up size or reach and all these things in your prime, but when you get past prime, Greb and Langford both, they really sort of push the limits of the opposition you can, you know, the levels of adversity that they could face when they weren't the guys they used to be, but they were still world class. So for me, just like say with George Foreman, Big George, when he won the title, you know, decades later, some people would have that as one of his best wins, you know, absolute best wins because of his condition, because he was older and large and less mobile, had to change his style to adapt. He went with the cross-arm guard. You know, Greb did some other things. From what you said, BL, he'd tie people up a lot, bring them in close where he wouldn't have to judge the range as much. But yeah,
he was so experienced. One of his tricks is he would hop in quickly. He would hop in quickly, and he would use either his left or right arm to put it under their arm, their opposing arm, and thus grip them there. So then they were right next to him, so he could repeatedly hit him with the other hand. Whereas at any slight range, his punches sometimes were falling short or going behind the guy's head because of that depth perception. So when he got him in close, that was the area where he could repeatedly hit him. So yeah, it was one of his style changes that he went through due to the damage to his eye. But through all his earlier fights as well, he was a very, very experienced inside fighter. And inside, he is known for rubbing laces in corner of fighters' eyes to cause severe cuts and lacerations, biting people on shoulder. One guy he was fighting with on inside, and Greb eye gouged him. And referee said, "Harry, what are you doing?" And Harry Greb said, "I'm gouging his eye, can't you tell?" He was just a crazy competitor, but just saying, "I'm gouging his eye, ref, can't you see?" Another guy who kept hitting him with jabs, he grabbed his wrist when he threw a jab and then sank his teeth into his glove and wouldn't let go. Referee were trying to push his head off his glove, just some crazy stuff. But yeah, a fierce competitor, and I think that shows in some of these years we're going through is stubborn refusal to lose, or if he did lose, come back and whip you as soon as possible. There were stories he'd challenge the fighter in the ring after they beat him, demanding immediate rematch, and even sometimes saying, "Let's go again now. I'll fight you again now, another 10 rounds." Incredible compare, and I think that shows in his results. He had a crazy will to win.
Yeah, he was obviously someone who had some stuff stored up. He was letting out on everybody. I'd heard a story that he was bullied. A group of people were bullying him when he was young, and when he finally snapped and got them all, gave him some fists. Now he was 100% into it. And if you look at his career, just the speed with which he was laying out these bookings and following through and keeping that win-loss record, like there's no shame in losing to absolute prime Gene Tunney with a weight disadvantage. But look at everything else he did this year, and this the closeness of the fight between, he fights the great Mickey Walker, but it's only 2 weeks later he's fighting the also great Maxie Rosenblum. Both of those fighters are very clever and tough in their own ways and could exploit a declined fighter. But in this case, he pulled it out. And just a couple weeks apart, it really blows my mind. There were, depending on what I was thinking about, what I chose to think about, I could have seen a lot of different years in different slots, but that really stood out to me that it needed top 5 inclusion to be inside my top 5.
If I may add just 2 more quick points, Maxie Rosenblum, who is now in my top 10 fighters of all time, a staggering 300-ish fight career with an incredible resume. He cited Harry Greb after that fight. That fight actually had a large impact on Maxie Rosenblum because it led to a morph in a Maxie Rosenblum style where he adapted a more Ken Overlin style. Ken Overlin was called poor man's Harry Greb. He threw a lot of punches. He was durable. He was hard to break down. As Azad Charles found out, he had very difficult fights with Ken Overlin, as many other fighters did. But the defeat to Greb, where Greb mauled Rosenblum and overpounded him, and Rosenblum couldn't live with him. Rosenblum actually brought in changes where he started throwing lots of punches, in trying to throw blizzards of punches, trying to emulate Greb by overscoring and overpowering his opponents. It actually led to the defeat affected Rosenblum to where it inspired him to try and do what Greb was able to do. And Rosenblum, of course, later as a top 10 all-time fighter, with his resume fighting John Henry Lewis as an old great fighters he fought, he just said plainly Harry Greb was the greatest fighting man he'd ever seen. So, those wins also left an impression on some of these great fighters as well, who are great fighters themselves, which kind of says how good Harry Greb was and how hard he was to beat.
Absolutely. Shout out to 86 Boxing and Boxer at Rest. Hey, fellas. Thanks for joining us. Questions or comments, throw them in the chat, people. Thanks to everyone after the fact listening as well. We appreciate all of you. We're just thrilled to celebrate one of boxing's great fighters here. So, Scrapbook, is this time to unveil your number 3, sir?
Sure, my number 3. Obviously, it might be different than everyone else's, but mine's is 1915. He had 22 fights that year. What was interesting about it is he was in a ring with not Hall of Famers, but he was in it with George Chipp, who wound up becoming a middleweight champion. He would lose his title to Frank Klaus, but he was a very good fighter with George Chipp. He was also in a ring with Kid Graves. 1916 is where he broke a bone. And what was interesting thing about that was just a few weeks later, he was back in the ring again, and he was in excruciating pain. He fought 3 times in July, twice in June, 2 times in May, twice in April, 4 times in March, and 4 times in January of that year. So that's very tough for a young man to accomplish. But he was also in the ring with Faye Kaiser. Now, Faye Kaiser in 1919, he was in the ring in the AEF, America's Expeditionary Forces, against Bob Martin. They called him Fighting Bob Martin. Faye Kaiser fought as a heavyweight. So he was always very strong. But he was in the ring with Harry Greb a total of 9 times, but he fought him 3 times that year. And I thought it was very, very tough for Harry Greb to pull off something like that. But he did. So my choice is 1915 for my number 3.
Excellent choice. What a year. There's all these different years. There's so many things to admire about what Greb was able to, like you said, what he was able to pull off. I mean, talk about racing uphill. And BL, you mentioned the other day, you mentioned a lot, to your credit, just how much Greb did before he got a world title opportunity. Not like today, like guys won 15 fights and he goes, hey, you're ducking me, I want a title fight. You know, Greb had hundreds of fights at that point. Certain fighters, they've done more than most fighters before they even get to title level. So Greb's career is one of those best examples, in my opinion, of a great career that is totally misrepresented if you look at his title fights. In fact, those middleweight title defenses, I don't think most people would count those amongst his, say, top 10 greatest wins, because, you know, in this era, guys were matched really tough, and he was matched as tough as anyone could be, but so were a lot of great fighters, so they all fought each other or close to it. BL, can you make some sense of what I said there? The thrust of what I was saying?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, he did have over 220 fights before getting a title shot, and he'd already beaten Hall of Fame fighters, you know, across multiple divisions, and past or future champions across multiple divisions, and had incredible fight runs and set records for unbeaten year, like he's 45-0. But you know, the title fight came in 1923 against Johnny Wilson, and Harry Greb actually was quoted as saying, if I don't whip this guy now, I'll never get another title shot, because he'd already had over 220 fights. And Wilson, for a few years before that, everybody knew that Greb was going to be champion if he could get Wilson or whoever were champion in ring for that middleweight title. They just knew that Greb was going to beat whoever was there. And it's important to note that Johnny Wilson had a lot of pressure put on him. There were even calls for him to be banned, for his title to be stripped off him and given to Greb, because he just did not want to fight Harry Greb at all. Certain states weren't keen on putting fights on, which is why during the build-up to Harry Greb fighting Johnny Wilson actually for that time was quite inactive, for that time when fighters were very active and had very big schedules. And part of the reason is a lot of people didn't want to showcase him, because he was seen as a yellow belly. Many people said he was a coward, that he should put his title online against his #1 contender, Harry Greb, and eventually he did. And it's just, I think, a funny coincidence that Johnny Wilson kept Greb waiting so long for that middleweight title shot, that when Harry Greb got in there, he actually said before the fight, I ain't gonna fight, I'm not gonna fight Dirty Harry. He said, I'm gonna win every round. But he fought actually for himself quite a careful fight, because he was very keen that he didn't want to suffer a DQ loss or give the referee any excuse to throw him out of there when he'd finally got a world champion in the ring to challenge for his title officially. So Harry Greb fought a very patient fight. He won the fight fairly easily. There wasn't too much drama against him in that fight, as most people expected. But due to that, most of his title fights are later in his career, and you know, aside from the Tiger Flowers fights, the Mickey Walker fight, of course, one of great middleweight battles, many of his middleweight title defenses were not the greatest names. He'd already beaten way greater fighters, you know, like Gene Tunney and the Gibbons brothers and Loughran and Smith. He'd already beaten greater fighters for the most part, other than like Flowers and Mickey Walker, those guys. But it just adds him to that list of world champions. It gives him that legitimacy as a middleweight champion, you know, in the history books, which to me doesn't always fully matter. You know, I rate some fighters higher than champions who were never champions, like George Cole. I rate George Cole way higher than many world champions, some even long-reigning champions. But yeah, he did give Harry Greb that middleweight title, but he had, like you said, beaten better fighters, many of them before that.
Yeah, and I think time distills out people's understanding. So this stuff is so far in the past, and so much exciting and accessible fighting has happened since then that people forget this era. Like Greb he might have been an outlier in just the sheer number of fights he had year to year, but he was never the only guy having a crazy year. As I've been looking through these records these last few years, so many guys had over 100 fights before they're even old. They might be getting on in fight years, but like they're young men, they're in their 20s with over 100 fights. That's not something we really see today. We see maybe with amateur, but as far as professional fighting under those conditions, and this was a rough time, you know. I'm sure, you know, Greb, people have said he's a dirty fighter, and you know, of course, he definitely took some liberties, but he wasn't the only one. Tunney had his own controversy about what appeared to be a left hook right to the Johnson. Won him a fight, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, because I watched the video, and as soon as he lands it, he looks over to the ref, like almost like, "Did you see me do that?" I don't know. It's grainy, the footage, but certainly Harry Greb wasn't the only fighter who took liberties, and some of these guys, when it became a dirty fight, they were ready to go for that. So, like a boxer, puncher, mauler, you could say, like they had that third gear, that danger gear, and Greb was definitely that guy. Like if you were going to initiate a dirty fight, he'd be right there with you, and sometimes he'd be there if you weren't.
Two other points I'd like to raise. One is on this year that Scrapbooks chose, because it is a very important year as well for another reason I'll just briefly describe to the listeners. But secondly, Harry Greb must get enormous credit for fighting the black fighters of his time, because I criticised Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey and a number of fighters. Tunney ignored challenges from Wills. He ignored challenges from Norfolk. He wouldn't fight, you know, Tiger Flowers. You know, Harry Greb fought Jack Blackburn this year. You know, he also fought Tiger Flowers more than once. He also fought Kid Norfolk more than once. He didn't fight Harry Wills. Someone came to me once saying, "Oh, well, I don't think Greb's great because he didn't fight Harry Wills." I'm like, well, you know, he can't fight everybody. I mean, yeah, he didn't fight the great Black Panther, but my goodness, he fought pretty much everyone else. I wouldn't expect Harry Greb to fight a 230-pound prime Harry Wills. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous as a 5'8" middleweight who weighs 162. But you know, some people are never happy. But you know, he deserves enormous credit. I mean, even after Tiger Flowers beat him, Harry Greb went to stay with Tiger Flowers to protect him if any mobs came to attack him. You know, so he deserves an enormous amount of credit for that. When I heard that story that Harry Greb went to defend Tiger Flowers, you know, in that time when there still was a lot of prejudice against the black community, that signals him as a true competitor who didn't see race, didn't see, you know, people being cast into this pot or that pot. He was just a ferocious competitor, and he could show respect to Tiger Flowers enough to go defend him physically, saying he'll whip anybody who comes for him. I mean, incredible story. But the first point I want to mention as well is this year 1915 is a few years into his pro career, and he has not yet fully morphed into the all-out whirlwind attacking Harry Greb style. That happened after a fight against a guy called Willie Brennan, where Greb before the fight said, "You know what, I'm going to go in and right from first bell, I'm going to punch until I can't punch anymore." Now, as Greb said after the fight, "Well, I realised I can punch for 10 rounds without much trouble," which of course led to the whirlwind attacking style, because he's great. Almost as interesting as his career growth through his opponents through his career is his style growth through his career. He started out more rugged, mauling, brawling. You know, he still had speed, he still had a high punch output, but he didn't use them fully to his advantage. Over 1915 and then into 1916, he fully started morphing into that style where he would go all out, jumping around. You couldn't pin him down. He'd just unleash barrages of punches on you. And then he maintained that kind of style until the earlier 20s, when he started suffering the eye damage, and he couldn't quite do that anymore. He couldn't time his hops in, you know, his famous hop in, what he'd use to like get you on the back foot so he could just steamroller you with multiple punches coming from all angles. You know, he had to change his style. So it's interesting as well on his career to watch the development of his style and then the adjustment of his style in 20s after suffering eye damage. Just another good point about 1915. This is an earlier version of Harry Greb, but he's still fighting or beating or losing or drawing to great fighters like Billy Misk. He beat Jack Blackburn. Blackburn landed a lot of stinging shots on Greb, especially in rounds 2 to 4, but Greb overworked him. Billy Misk is a highly underrated fighter, historically, by pretty much most boxing fans, except for people like me and Scrap, who know Billy Misk and his incredible career and how tough of a fighter he was. You know, but still a very tough year, very good year.
Absolutely, and great points there. And, you know, just like Sam Langford and a lot of other great fighters, the kind of experience he gained for himself before he hit his actual fight prime. It's almost like when fighters are this busy while they're young, with the right, if they have all the other characteristics, they have like a super prime because they're always in fight trim. They're always in fight shape. Like Greb, you had mentioned in one of his later years, which I'm sure is going to come up, he broke his hand multiple times, but he still had an undefeated season. That's a testament to the kind of condition he was in physically, to where even if he was missing a tool, a very important tool like one of your hands when you only have two, he was still able to win and beat great fighters. It just blows the mind. It's been such a pleasure studying for this, but I still feel completely out of my depth. And I'm still back in the first 5 years of Langford's career. A year after I started going in deep.
It's all good, mate. It's all good. It's all good. As boxing fans, when Scrapbook started out, he knew very little. He's developed over time. When I started out, I knew very little. I just saw Leonard and Duran battling, and then Trunks were writing on, and all furore and crowd now are just obsessed from that point. I knew very little, and you will develop and grow, believe me. And 2 years from now, you'll be so much deeper than you are now. And 3 years after that, you'll be way deeper than you are 2 years from now. You will grow and progress, believe me, into something else, I think. But, yeah, you're doing fine. Absolutely fine.
Oh, I appreciate the encouragement from both you guys. Like, I'm not a young person. I'm middle-aged, but this is a more recent passion for me. But I've loved combat sports. I've been following mixed rules intently for about 15 years and casually fight sports before then. But yeah, this has just been incredible and enriching. And that's why, BL, that's why I sent you the thing I sent you as a thank you.
Yes, I was going to mention that. I'm overjoyed. I picked it up from my friend and seen a cardboard box, and I'm like, oh, what's this? And I opened it, and it's fantastic. I'm actually getting a special frame with a special plaque engraved. I'm going to get the plaque engraved, the mighty Sam Langford, and it's going in a special picture frame in a place of prominence in my living room. Thank you very much. I'm really touched by that. No one's ever got me anything like that, outside of my immediate family's kind of circles. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, kindling a passion in somebody else is singular, and I definitely have spent enough hours that I felt like I should do something. Just say thanks for the uninitiated. Watching one of BL's videos on Sam Langford I was like, okay, wait a minute, this guy did what? And he's from Boston, where I live. And so I've been studying for about 3 years, I guess, give or take. But that's all thanks to you and also Scrapbook, because when I started to look around, I saw great articles on the fightcity.com, who I work with in the background now, and I'll have some articles on Langford coming up. There's one in draft mode that'll come out probably this week on an aspect of Sam Langford's career, but also checking out Scrapbook's videos and just being blown away by the stories, the information. So Scrapbook, thank you also to you. I'm just very grateful. I'm just very blessed.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, both of you guys are unbelievable, and I appreciate every single time I hear you speak. And you're absolutely right, Random, with Harry Greb. Not only one hand, but one eye, and we have to remember these things. We sometimes take things for granted. I mean, I can imagine me with a piece of eyelash in my eye, how frustrating that is, and you have gloves on, and you're trying to get the eyelash out. But imagine a guy throwing punches at you. He was fighting heavyweights at the same time, and he had the run that he had, where he was fighting 2 or 3 times a month. We take that for granted. And yeah, you have a lot of people say, yeah, Harry Greb, he bit and he scratched and he hit low. But you have to understand, here's a man who was in there in the fighting pugilism game with guys who had more experience with him at some times, heavyweights, light heavyweights, and middleweights. So he's in there to do what he has to do. But I give him a lot of credit for what he has done. And that's why I appreciate him the way I do.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a gentleman worth celebrating. Him. What a competitor. Like some of these fights when, it's an overwhelming amount of information. I know we're not going to go super duper detailed on this. We've just been skimming, as you have to with a 300 fight career. But some of these, he's fighting great fighters, sometimes just days or weeks apart. And I just want to quickly shout out the chat, because I appreciate you guys being here. Thanks for listening. Anyone who has to listen afterwards, I have to do that a lot. So thank you also. So 86 Boxing, Boxer at Rest, big up Rodolfo. Rodolfo is very passionate about this stuff. Nick Harmer, welcome, sir. And Trex, salute. Yeah, thanks all for coming. And if you have any questions, drop them in there. Otherwise, we're just going to be unveiling sort of like this moderate barrage of information. So, BL, do you, if we've touched enough on
Yeah.
1915, would you like to unveil your number three, sir?
My number three. We are shooting a bit forward from 1915 into the period what I call Greb's probable best overall run, or best overall 3-year run, and it's one of those years, 1918, where Harry Greb had over 20 fights, okay, suffered a few defeats, again, fought over 200 career rounds in 1918, and this was following another insane year that I will get to on my next pick. But 1918, Harry Greb is kind of approaching the peak era of his powers in terms of the jumping jack top, the swarming, mauling, aggressive style. At this point, he was actually overwhelming most of his opponents were blizzards of punches. In fact, many writers at time during this period from like 1917 to 1922 just awestruck by him, saying, oh no, he's going to explode, he can't keep punching like that, no fighter can keep punching like that, you know, after 2 or 3 rounds. And then after 8 rounds, they're like, well, we can't believe it, he's punching even more, he's throwing even more punches, he's just going even faster, he's like insane, he's crazy, he's just a punching machine. Thus again the name the Pittsburgh Windmill. Some people think he got that name because he stands there and windmills, but actually no, he didn't punch like that at all. He had a totally different style to that. Many people say, oh, he just comes forward, Jake LaMotta, he's tough and he just swings his hands. No, he didn't fight like that either. He fought master boxers and they had massive trouble dealing with him, pinning him down, landing clean on his chin. You know, after the only two stoppage losses in his whole career, both earlier in his career. One, Scrapbook, I believe, touched on against Perry Graves, aka Kid Graves, to people who look on websites, Perry Graves, and the other to Tough Fighter, who was actually said, oh, it's a bit of a jump up in class, this, when he actually fought George Chip's brother, Joe Chip. And that was the fight where Harry Greb was legitimately stopped. And Harry Greb, after the ring, said, well, I were in corner. And then next thing I know, I don't know, I'm stood here. Outside ring. George Chip was a tough fighter. He was thrown in a bit at deep end. But, you know, 1918, okay, is a completely crazy, insane year. When you look at it starting out, you know, he fights Augie Ratner, okay, he fights Augie Ratner and fights Augie Ratner over 20 rounds. Now, that was actually a very tough fight for Harry Greb. Harry Greb, that fight were kind of fairly level pegging to a lot of people after 18 rounds, and Greb put on one of his spurts and just went crazy wheeling punches for the last 2 rounds, 19 and 20, but got the win. But that was a tough fight. Augie Ratner is a very, very tough fighter and goes very underrated, very excellent fighter. He also followed that up, okay, in February, you know, by beating former light heavyweight Bob Mohar. Okay, and then he lost. Now, this is a fight that I'm finding highly contentious at the moment, and I'm really appreciative you put the fight up there as Mike O'Dowd as a loss, because I came across someone the other day, well, not the other day, the other week, who admitted to me that they're revisionists and they're trying to remove defeats off Harry Greb's record. Now, I have known Harry Greb to have lost to Mike O'Dowd for over a decade, but now everybody's calling it a draw. Now, I am aware that some newspaper writers did call that fight a draw, but for over a decade, that fight was seen as a loss, okay? So whether you accept that as a draw or a loss is up to you. I call it a loss, okay? I call it a loss, and I will not change my mind. But he then, after beating Bob Mohar, only 7 days later loses to middleweight Hall of Famer Mike O'Dowd. And then, less than 2 weeks later, fights the Hoosier Bearcat, Jack Dillon, the Giant Slayer, whipping him on points over 12 rounds in a, you know, easier win than what many people expected. Then, only 7 days later, he beats former light heavyweight champion Mike McTeague. So already, just in that first few months of 1918, he's beaten Augie Ratner in a 20-rounder. He's beaten Bob Mohar. He's lost to O'Dowd. He's beat light heavyweight Hall of Famer Jack Dillon. He's beat light heavyweight champ Mike McTeague. All in the space of a few months. And 1918 goes on. He has over 20 fights that year. You know, he carries on. He fights Al McCoy and beats him. He were at the time, you know, around that time, a lineal middleweight champion. He also fights and beats the tough contender Clay Turner, and also beats another super tough contender who gets very underrated, Soldier Barfield, who once gave Harry Greb a real lesson on how to spear people with a left hand. He then beats Soldier Barfield again, and we're still in first half of the year. Then in second half of the year, what happens again? Okay, he beats Bob Mohart again. He beats Soldier Barfield again. He also beats the very excellent contender Eddie McGaughty before beating the current reigning lineal light heavyweight champion at World, battling Levinsky, before beating Clay Turner again, before fighting Billy Misk, okay, with earlier fought. So just an incredible year, stacked with Hall of Fame opponents, great wins, you know, some defeats in there. A really tough year, but Harry Greb for an insane amount of competition that year, not only in champions and Hall of Famers, but fighting other fighters, you know, like I've highlighted, like Soldier Barfield, Eddie McGaughty, you name it, he fought a who's who that year. Incredible year, 1918, my third best year.
Yeah, that's righteous. My goodness, what a body of work. And, you know, he was at or near the peak of his powers. Would you say you could call what you would consider his absolute peak?
No, I would say his absolute peak is, I think he was coming into like his more prime, 1917 into 1918. I'd say his real prime peak is 1919 to 1922. I'd say that was, you know, him at his absolute best. But even in 1918 and 1917, he was still doing miraculous things. But it's hard to judge a fighter's peak sometimes, because with his fight runs over these years, you'd look and say, well, he's in his peak now. But, you know, I'd more go 1919. I think these years, 17 and 18, prepared him for the feat of 1919, which then he carried on with some more solid, incredible years in 20, 21 and 22 and 23.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing that he must have been just miraculously good because, you know, with the combination of experience and speed and stamina, because in 1919, as you said, he broke his hand multiple times and he still went undefeated, but not just undefeated, he went undefeated over 45 fights. Might be the greatest year in boxing history, for me at least. The toughest year, I have Sam Langford's 1916, but the greatest year of performances, I think I have him. It's 1919, I think.
Before one of those fights, I don't really want to jump. I'll talk 1919 when we get onto it, I'm sure. But just to highlight Greb's mentality, in fact, I'll discuss that about 1919 when we get on it. But I'll just say, you know, he'd suffered a break on his hand, and he'd suffered the break 4 days ago. It had not even healed, and he had a fight. And his handler said, "Oh, Harry, you can't fight. You've got a break in your hand." And Harry Greb just said, "Well, I don't need 2 hands to beat him. I can beat him with just 1 hand." And he did. And he beat him on points over 10 rounds. I mean, incredible. He fought with a broken hand. He didn't care. He just wanted to fight and win.
Oh, my goodness. Scrap, anything to add on for 1918 while we have it up?
Yeah, 1918 is also my third greatest year for Harry Greb. Here's a man who had 22 fights. He had 4 fights in January, 3 in February, 2 in June, 3 July, 3 March, 4 May, 2 August. I mean, you can't get much better than that. He was in the ring with fighters such as Mike O'Dowd. Now, he fought Al McCoy. Al McCoy was the middleweight champion, and Mike O'Dowd took the title away from him. That was incredible. 1920 to 1923. You had a fighter by the name of Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson took the title away from Mike O'Dowd. So Mike O'Dowd was a very good fighter, very underrated. Then Harry Greb was also in the ring with Bob Mohart, who was a heavyweight. He was in the ring with battling Levinsky, who was a light heavyweight. In fact, he was the America's light heavyweight champion, and Gene Tunney took the title away from him. But what's really amazing to me, you got guys like Soldier Barfield. A lot of people don't know who Soldier Barfield was. He lived in Brooklyn. He moved to Philadelphia. He's very underrated. Very underrated was Jacob Soldier Barfield. But he fought him in 1918 as well. He's in the ring with Clay Turner, as BL had mentioned. Mike Mateague, who wound up becoming the light heavyweight champion when he would defeat Battling Siki. So Jack Dillon, the Giant Slayer. I mean, he was a light heavyweight champion. Look at all of the champions he fought in that year. So you have to give him a great deal of credit for handling that particular year, 1918, with the amount of fighters that he fought, the quality of fighters that he fought, and then getting into his next year, which is one of the greatest years in boxing history, in 1919. I mean, you can't ask much more for a fighter who had the amount of tools that he had. He didn't have his iron pyramid yet, but he was in a lot of tough fights. He broke his hand several times. So you got to give him a lot of credit for that year in 1918. I have it number 3 as BL does as well. Great pick, BL.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
Yeah, definitely, gentlemen. That was almost my number 3 pick. I was torn. I got really torn. The only one I was sure about was number 1, and even that I had to reaffirm in my mind that I wasn't overlooking anything else, because all of these years are bizarre. For my number 3, I actually went with 1917. And, this was one of the 2 years where I couldn't even fit it all in one column and have the text legible. He fought so often. And it was between this and 18, I felt like. But just look, it's the work rate. And, can you guys estimate maybe how many of these fights he's giving up size in?
Let me have a look.
That's a great choice, Random. Great choice, 1917.
He's given away weight in a number of fights, more keenly to Dillon and Levinsky. But he's also fighting a lot of fighters around his own weight in that year as well. Harry Greb also at times in his career, he'd have signed catch fights because there was no super middleweight division. So you could actually have a fight now. Boxing fans now, what they have a habit of doing is looking back and seeing a fight at 163 and saying, "Oh, that's a light heavyweight fight." No, boxing didn't work that way back then. We don't have the weight divisions and rules we have now. Basically, fights that have weights, attached, and sometimes they'd have middleweight fights where Harry Greb had signed coming at 158 or 159 or 157. Other middleweight fights he'd come in at 162 or 163. That's just how they did it back then. They were not light heavyweight fights. But he did give away certainly weight in some of those years. But I think more the weight giving from going from 1915 to 1917, I think it were more leaving 18 into 1920, where he started giving away more weight when he were fighting Tunney's, who were growing and developing, when he were fighting Bill Brennan's, when he were fighting many of these guys. I think that's when he started giving away more weight. It's worth noting that Harry Greb used to whip Bill Brennan far easier than Jack Dempsey did, which is an incredible point. But yeah, it's an insane year. It's an insane year, 1917. I'll touch on it when I get to my pick. But yeah, it's incredible year.
Yeah, and I was torn between this and 18. Sorry, go ahead, Scrapbook.
No, I apologize. I just wanted to add on to what BL was mentioning. You got to look at it. When he fought Jacob Soldier Barfield, November 2nd, 1917, he would go back down in weight to fight George Chipp, November 19th, 1917. Then he would go up in weight to fight Willie Meehan, December 3rd, 1917.
Yeah, he was a heavyweight at the time. Yeah, Willie Meehan.
Incredible.
Yeah, and the 3-fight run, the reason it ended up nudging out, or that it, was because I was torn, but that run of fighting Dillon Levinsky and Jeff Smith, between July 30th and September 11th, 3 world-class operators, and just as part of this gigantic year. I mean, these years I get a little overwhelmed because I'm not familiar with all these fighters, but even the ones that I am familiar with, it's like, this is just one year. This is a whole career today. This is a good career today. Like, can you imagine if you translated all those fighters over to today's brackets, you'd be like, oh my goodness, what is this guy doing? But yeah, just one of many great years. But that's my I have a suspicion that might come up, so I won't harp on it too much. But that one took number 3 spot for me. Now, just quick shout outs in the chat before we move forward. Haplo in the chat. What's up, Haplo? Guys are just having they're talking about someone won a contest or something. Congrats on that, whatever that might have been. All right, so straight back to it. Scrapbook, is it time for your number 2, my friend?
I guess it is. Number 2. My number 2, toughest year for Harry Greb. Believe it or not, for me, it might be a little different once again than everyone else's, but 1923 is a tough year for Harry Greb because of what he has gone through once again. You're looking at a man who, at this point in his career, he's in there with Tommy Loughran, and Johnny Wilson. He would defeat Johnny Wilson for the middleweight championship strap. He had the America's light heavyweight championship strap from Gene Tunney. He was in there with Len Rollins, another very underrated fighter, Pete Kaiser. I mean, so many good fighters in 1923. Chuck Wiggins, Soldier Jones. I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's a tough run within itself. And then if you look at when he fought them, he fought like 3 times in December, 2 times in November, 4 times in October, or 3 times in October. I mean, he didn't stop fighting. So when you look at 1919, when you look at 1917, 1918, some of the years that we chose, 1915, those run of fights, and then you get to 1922. That was the first number 5 best year that we all chose. And then you look at 1923, he picked up the title from a very good fighter in Johnny Wilson, who was a southpaw. Johnny Wilson was from Harlem, New York. He used to train at the Athletic Club. He sparred a lot with very good fighters during his time. Jeff Smith was one of his sparring partners, because Jeff Smith was from Brooklyn, and he moved over to Manhattan, Harlem, and then he would move over to Bayonne, New Jersey. So that was a very tough run for Harry Greb. So I chose 1923. Very, very good year. He was in there with some of the best during his time. He also fought some really good fighters, you know, off circuit, which is not on record. So it was a very good year for Harry Greb, but it's a very tough year for him as well, based on what he has gone through 1919, 1917, 1918, 1922.
100%. Would you like to add to that, PL?
Only in saying that I actually considered 1923 for my top 5, and the reasons why, kind of like what Scrapbook says, the what he's gone through already, is now his eyesight's now starting to get damaged more and more. But the opposition this year, you know, he fights Tommy Loughran twice in a 15-day period. You know, fighting 25 rounds against one of all-time great light heavyweights in 15 days. Okay, winning both. He loses to Gene Tunney, who's now morphed into full-blown heavyweight over 15 rounds. He then loses to Tommy Loughran. He then beats Lou Bogash. Then he beats Chuck Wiggins. But then he beats another very good fighter, Brian Downey, a fighter that Scrapbook will be aware of, but many listeners may not be. He was a very capable fighter. He was a top contender for middleweight title at one point. He then loses to Gene Tunney again, and then beats Tommy Loughran. But even when you look there, like Scrapbook pointed, you know, about 3 fights in December. Those 3 fights are over 23 days, is it 24 days? He beats Brian Downey, he beats Tommy Loughran, and he loses to Gene Tunney, all in a space of just over 3 weeks. And this kind of symbolizes what we mean when we say that fighters now will fight once or twice a year. Really, it's hard to compare them to fighters who would fight 3 or 4 times a month, and for many months in a year, fight that level of opposition. Gene Tunney and Loughran in 1 month, with Brian Downey added in there. You know, January, 2 fights with Tommy Loughran. You know, and many of Greb's years, like on my number 2 year to come, I'll highlight another little insane fight run over a number of days. But, you know, yeah, incredible pick. I really did consider it, Scrapbook. I would really had a headache on that one. I wanted to try and get it in, but there's so many great years on this guy's career.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I struggled too. I was like, can I not can I possibly make a top 5 that doesn't have this year in it? But like you said, he had so many great years. It's hard to have a wrong list or a list that feels totally right. I mean, I think that he has 1 year that if it's not in the top 5, you haven't looked at that year, but we all know that, and we're going to get to that. But yeah, the level of competition he's facing past his prime, much like Sam Langford and other boxers in history, but guys who can stay dangerous at the highest levels at that schedule past their prime.
Yeah, like Nicholson Charles and people like that, yeah.
Yeah, and then when you add in that he was basically cycloptic in the last few years of his career, just like from mid-1917 on to 26, Langford was cycloptic. You know, so these guys are having to fight on field, they're having to fight on experience, and just so the level of brilliance that they're exhibiting is another level. They're having super careers, super CVs, as you say, BL. Like, it's just another level to where a lot of these individual years would be a respectable career for a fighter who's in the middle of their career. And a couple of these years would make a great career for a modern boxer. Like, if that's what they did in 20 years, you'd be like, wow. We will get to that. So Hardline, would you like to unveil your number 2, sir?
Yes, my number 2 is the incredible year of 1917, which is an insane year for a few things. Point one, he had 37 fights that year. I mean, 37 fights that year. That averages to 3 fights a month. And considering opposition and fight runs, it is incredible. He only lost 2 times in that year with 1 draw, 34 wins. He also fought nearly 300 career rounds in that 1 year alone. Now, just to give anyone an idea, 300 career rounds is more than some multi-year top 10 rated fighters now have fought in their entire career. In just 1 year. You know, it really is incredible. And it's not his busiest year for rounds. He has won over 400 rounds that I'm sure we're going to get onto. But 1917 is a crazy year for a number of things. Not only the activity, but also one important little facet is in February, he fights the St. Paul Phantom Mike Gibbons. Okay, some people have told me, no, Tommy was better. No, Mike was better. In my mind, Mike was the better fighter out of Mike and Tommy. Even Tommy attested to that himself. But Mike Gibbons. Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Scrapbook. Yeah, you were trying to tell me Tommy were the better brother. I'm like, no, I don't buy that. But Mike Gibbons, he lost to Mike Gibbons. Now, one interesting thing about that is Mike Gibbons would not have a loss in his career after that fight right until a point in 1919 when a certain Harry Greb whips him in a rematch, okay, showing that how good Gibbons still was at that time. He also beat Willie Brennan in February, Willie K.O. Brennan, you know, who was not an elite level fighter, but a tough handful. He was a tough handful. He was rugged. He was fairly durable. He beat Al McCoy, you know, in April, beat Jeff Smith in May, and then only 3 days later, beat George Chip. Okay, so he beats Jerome Jeffords, okay, in May 1917, and only 3 days later, okay, beats George Chip, former lineal middleweight champion, who was better than his brother Joe Chip. Very tough, rugged fighter, could fight very dirty, knew all the tactics of using elbows inside to get a few sneaky hits in there under your chin with his elbows. You know, really tough, rugged fighter. To beat Jeff Smith and George Chip, both on points over 10 rounds, in only 3 days. 3 days, that is incredible. Now, the following month, he beats Frank Mantell, a very capable fighter. But then in July, I want people to really think about this run here, okay? He beats Bud Krause at the start of July, okay? He takes Krause out in 6 rounds, and Bud Krause, again, was a good fighter. But it's this run here I want to focus on. Now, at the end of July, he beats Jack Dillon, okay, the Hussey Bearcat. Then, okay, a week later, he beats on points over 10 rounds, battling Levinsky, the current reigning lineal light heavyweight champion from 16 to 20. Then, okay, in early September, approaching mid-September, he beats Jerome Jeffords. Now, that is 3 Hall of Fame fighters Harry Greb beat individually in, I think, 41 or 42 days. He fought 30 rounds in 41 or 42 days, all 3 of them Hall of Famers. He beat 3 Hall of Famers back-to-back. You know, added on to what he's done already, you know, with Krause and Mantell and Chip and Smith already, and Al McCoy, who we beat in April, you know, added on to the earlier fights in the year against Mike Gibbons where he lost, etc., etc. But when you go on past that, you know, he has a whole number more fights for the rest of the year. It beats George Chip again. It beats Willie Meehan. Now, you know, Scrapbook mentioned Willie Meehan, and it's a very good point because Willie Meehan, around this time, 1917, 1920, he was giving Jack Dempsey hell in fights. Harry Greb beat him easily. Harry Greb outsped him and speared him with multiple punches. He couldn't even really get close to Greb. Greb at this time was jumping around like a crazed animal, you know, and you basically couldn't pin him down. He easily beat Willie Meehan. You know, when Dempsey always had difficult fights with him because of Meehan's like tie-up and messy style, you know, Dempsey couldn't always work it out. He also beat lost to Soldier Barfield. I remember reading old newspaper articles of Soldier Barfield, clever fighter he was, underrated fighter he was, kept spearing Harry Greb with those nice left hands of his, you know. But yeah, just an incredible year. 37 fights with only 2 defeats, beating multiple Hall of Famers, multiple former champions. Just an incredible year.
Absolutely. Also, big shout out to Jay Wolf, who is a mixed martial arts super fan of the old school. And MMA, you know, the UFC brand of MMA started in 93. So he goes all the way back to that. So for MMA terms, but he actually requested this. He wanted us to do a thing. If you remember, BL, he requested this when we were doing our Sam Langford top 5. So this came together. So thank you, Jay Wolf. Yeah, so big shout out to Jay Wolf, and just a special thanks to UBL and you Scrapbook for your time. This is fantastic for me. I've been really really excited for this, and I know some of the listeners have also really been eagerly anticipating this countdown. Just to hear people celebrate the great Harry Greb. I mean, it's really like a close examination of his career. I'm sure after all these years, you're still learning things about him. So some of these guys, they do so much. You just have to learn what you can. I'm doing that with Langford. I may never even get to his late teens career because it's taken so long, but it's so enriching studying
One of
this
the good
era of
thing
boxing.
about one of the good thing about 1917 is Harry Greb had a lot of fights in Pittsburgh, his hometown, and in Pittsburgh, by 1920s, early 1920s, Harry Greb was seen as by many in Pittsburgh like a god. He was a folk hero in Pittsburgh. Even future Pittsburghers, like Billy Conn would rave that he was the greatest fighting thing they'd ever seen. He, he was like an icon at times in Pittsburgh later in his career, and it's all based off this incredible work he put in, and the incredible battles from one of his early fights with Willie Brennan that the host said were most incredible action-packed fight he'd ever seen at that venue in years. It wasn't only about Harry Greb was chalking up big fight runs, big win runs. He was giving the crowd spectacular performances, just throwing over 100 punches around for 10 rounds, 12 rounds, 15 rounds. He'd have the guy wobbling like Mickey Walker in 14th round. Greb had him all. Let's see, Walker were taking an absolute lacing. And at the end of the round, Harry Greb still had that sportsmanship to say, yeah, I'll steer you to your corner. I'll help you back to your corner at end of 14th round smiling, It's not only that he's got the win runs and adding the Hall of Fame victories on there, it's the manner in which he's winning. He's completely burying a lot of these fighters and beating them real well and beating some of them easy. The fight here with Jack Dillon in July, I mentioned on 1918, he fought Jack Dillon again. Now, that was the second fight in 1918. That was an easier win. Now, Jack Dillon put his loss here down to the fact, I didn't take him seriously enough and didn't train. But 1918 rematch, Dillon trained fanatically, but got beat even worse because Greb were coming into his prime. So even though Dillon trained harder, he got whipped even worse. But Jack Dillon, it was a big guy by this time. He'd been campaigning at light heavyweight and heavyweight for years. He held wins over many heavyweights from that time. But, Harry Greb could beat them fairly easily, and he could beat bigger men fairly easily. Like Harry Greb himself said, I enjoy fighting big men. They get in their own way, meaning these guys are so big and cumbersome and clumsy compared to him that he can speed around them. They can't pin him down, and he finds it easy to fight him. If you consider that to nowadays, where elite level world fighters are arguing and complaining about a 10-pound hydration clause, or someone coming in 1 pound overweight, or fans complaining about one guy having a 5-pound weight advantage, and there's Harry Greb saying, "Oh, you want to put me in ring with a heavyweight? Put me in with them. I'll whip him easier. It's an easier night for me." It's the mentality of this guy was also incredible, as well as his career. Pardon me if I go on, but I love talking about Harry Greb and Langford, so I sometimes do have verbals, but I apologize.
Please go on. That's what we're here for. I'm here mostly to listen and learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was some year, and it did make my top 5 also. I'm gonna keep it moving forward as we come, drawing down now toward the finale, which I comfortably predict we'll all be talking about all at the same time. So for my number 2 year, I actually went with, and we already covered this, but I went with 1918. And it was between 17 and 18. He didn't have his winningest year, but the level of competition he's facing there, and coming off the schedule from the year before, like I was trying to think about, okay, he's in his prime, or he's coming into his prime, but he's also fighting a crazy schedule. So the wear and tear of those fights, even though he wasn't easy to hit once he got his technique down, it's got to do something to you. And so coming off 1917, I just thought to maintain this schedule here for 18 is just, just absurd. And the different styles he's fighting, and sometimes being the smaller guy, and just this driven competitor. But I'm not going to dwell on it because you beautifully touched on it. And I know we're probably all eager to get to our number 1. Who wants to say it?
Number one.
Number one. Harry Greb's toughest season.
I think we're all in the same decision on 45-0 for sure. 1919. Yeah. Go for it, BL.
No, sorry, Scrapbook. I'll let you announce it. I was just chuckling because I was thinking the same thing on as number two. Yep, we're all going for the big one.
Yeah, man. He was in there with Leo Florian Hook and Bill Brennan, battling Novinsky, Chuck Wiggins, Larry One Punch Williams, Bill Brennan. He fought him a few times. Billy Misk. He was in there with William Meehan, which is Bill Meehan. He was in there with Jay Turner, Silent Martin, Zulu Kid, Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter, George K.O. Brown, Jay Turner, Soldier Jones, Joe Burrell. Joe Burrell was also from New York. A lot of people don't know who Joe Burrell was. He moved to Philadelphia. Very, very good fighter was Joe Burrell. Very underrated. And Harry Greb was in the ring with him as well. You can't have a better year. You can't have a better fighter fighting in that same year than a Harry Greb. My hat's off to him. I have him number two, as all of us do, is the greatest fighter. No question about it.
Go ahead, BL. Unleash.
Oh, sorry, guys. I was on mute. Yeah, sorry. I'll just close that door. Yeah, before I unleash, yeah. 1919, Harry Greb's what they call his record year. And it's not a record year in most fights. It's not a record year in the overall toughest opposition to me, because like Random Acoustic Thoughts, I think Sam Langford's 1916 is a very hard year for any fighter in history to beat in terms of not winning element, but just overall opposition for year. But an incredible year, 45-0. 11 wins against champions or Hall of Famers, over 420 rounds fought in 1 year. Now, Scrapbook rightly made a great point earlier when he pointed out that Harry Greb would often fight men of differing weights within the same period. And one thing that makes 1919 such a great year is not only that he's entering his full prime from 1917, 1918, all those battles. He now reaches like a pinnacle here where he combines everything he's learned into this incredible year. And he would have had more fights than this, for a point I will mention. But Harry Greb, like Scrapbook greatly pointed out, some months he was fighting men at different weights. Some months in 1919, he'd fight a middleweight, then he'd fight a heavyweight, then he'd fight 2 fights against 2 light heavyweights. Then next month he'd fight 2 fights against a middleweight, then a fight against an heavyweight, then a fight against a light heavyweight. And he made the fighting men of different weights look easy this year. You know, it's an incredible thing, but he made it look easy. He was like, well, I'll come in at my optimum weight, anything between 159, 165, 166 pounds. I'll come in any weight between that, and I will fight men of any weight, whether it be heavyweight contenders like Bill Brennan, who Dempsey always had a lot of trouble with, even though fighters like, you know, other fighters could beat Billy Brennan easier. Harry Greb was one of them. But Bill Brennan was a heavyweight contender. He was a good puncher as well. He was a good fighter. Harry Greb could beat him way easier than Dempsey could. You know, in beating Leo Florian Hook, the great Hall of Fame mover, like flyweight to heavyweight, you know, encapsulating that when he fought Gunboat Smith. To solidify that claim, you know, to multiple wins over battling Levinsky, the still reigning light heavyweight champion of the world, you know, to beating Jeff Smith, to avenging the earlier defeat in 1917 to Mike Gibbons and ending a massive fight run that Mike Gibbons had not lost a fight from 1917 to now. Harry Greb was the man who ended that win run. But you look at the fight run 1919 in January. You know, he has multiple fights. He has 4 fights in January. You know, he has 4 fights in February. He has 5 fights in March. Now, in March alone, he's fighting Chuck Wiggins, Leo Hook, Bill Brennan, and Billy Misk all in 1 month. And those guys are at different weights. They're not all full heavyweights. You know, an incredible year. One thing I want to point out in this year, you will notice, okay, that his activity is very constant. You go from January, February, March, April, May, June, July. Then it gets to August, September, and October. You notice around September, October, his activity drops off to an extent. He suffered a few severe breaks. Okay, otherwise Harry Greb could have approached 50-0 this year, but you know he had to have some time off to let injuries to his hands. You know, lots of these fights went the distance. You know, he was fought so many rounds that he had sore hands. He was suffering breaks and damage when he were going into the last third of the year, and around that kind of September, October time, he did have to take some time out. It wasn't the first time he hurt his hand in 1919, but these were more severe than two of the earlier ones earlier in the year that he fought through and recovered from while he was still fighting and moving around. You know, but yeah, otherwise he would have had even more. Another point I'd like to make out that enabled this incredible year is that Harry Greb went 45-0 this year. Now, a lot of people now, you know, say like if Ricky hadn't signed to fight Mayweather, you know, he's maybe 40 pounds overweight. He has to spend the first 4 weeks in camp trimming all that weight off, trimming his nutrition down, eating less calories, training, running, doing cardio, get all that weight off. Then after 4 to 5 weeks of getting the weight off, then he's got to go into camp and start getting his timing, his sharpness back on point. And it's a labor. Harry Greb could fight men from middleweight, well, welterweight in 1919, welterweight to heavyweight, men across all 4 weights at the time, welterweight to heavyweight. But he was razor sharp because he was fighting week to week, sometimes more than once a week, and he was razor sharp. He didn't really even need to train between the fights because also he's traveling around. It's not only that he's 45-0, but he's traveling around to different cities having all these fights. So his training time was virtually nil a lot of the time because he's either traveling or he's promoting the fight or he's actually having the fight. And then next day he might be jumping on a train, going to this next city because he's got 1 or 2 fights booked there. Just an incredible year with very little training, really, because the fighting was his training. He was in peak condition. Fight to fight, he didn't have to train for 2 months to get his sharpness and timing back. He didn't have to train 2 months to build his strength up. You know, everything was on point, and it resulted in this incredible year. And I think 1919 was enabled by his incredible runs in 1917 and 1918. Okay, which is virtually 60 fights and over 500 rounds fought that prepared him for this onslaught in 1919. And it is a shame that he had that period, you know, September, October, where his activity dropped. Otherwise, he may have hit that 50-0, which would have been even more remarkable, considering the names he beat this year, the fighters he beat across multiple weights, you know, the cities and towns he travelled to have these fights, very little training time in between fights. Just incredible. I'm sorry I had to rant on that one. Incredible year, historically speaking. And to people who downplay it, I don't accept it. You know, the evidence is right there. You have to give this fighter incredible credit for what he accomplished this year.
Phenomenal breakdown, BL. Random, do you mind if I continue? I'd appreciate it.
Be my guest, sir. Go right ahead.
I mean, when you break this down even further, Billy Misk was such a tough fighter that his last fight was with Bill Brennan. Bill Brennan was a heavyweight who was in the ring with Jack Dempsey in 1920, New York's Madison Square Garden. But Billy Misk was such a tough fighter. He had bright disease, and we know the story. He wanted to have Christmas for his family, so he took on that last fight, and he was told not to by his physician with Bill Brennan. He would defeat Bill Brennan, and he would wind up giving or granting the wish of his family with the Christmas that they always desired. And after that, he would eventually die. But it just showed a testament to the man how tough Billy Misk was. He was in there with Mike Gibbons. Mike Gibbons was the St. Paul Phantom. He was the older brother of Tommy Gibbons. Mike Gibbons was one of the greatest middleweights that never won a title. He was one of the guys that was in line when Stanley Ketchel had passed away in 1910 to try and get that middleweight championship strap. But Billy Pappy wound up winning that tournament. He wound up getting that title back. But he was in there with Mike Gibbons, Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter, one of the greatest and toughest middleweights of all times. Harry Greb always said that Jeff Smith always gave him the most problems. And he fought Jeff Smith 7 times. But he fought Jeff Smith that year in 1919, along with some of the great fighters such as Battling Levinsky, who was America's light heavyweight champion. And Battling Levinsky would lose to Gene Tunney, but Battling Levinsky fought 3 fights in 1 day in 3 different states. Goes to show how tough he was. He was in there with Chuck Wiggins and Larry One Punch Williams, Silent Martin. I mean, Soldier Jones and Clay Turner, you name them, Joe Burrell, he was in there with them. Like Bill had alluded to, he was in there 3 times in September, twice in August, 4 times in July, 4 times in June, 4 times in November. 5 times in January, 4 times in February, 5 times in March, 5 times in April, 4 times in May. You only have 28 days in February, and he fought him 4 times in that particular month. So you're looking at one of the greatest years that a man of Harry Greb's size. He wasn't a big man, but he had the heart of a lion, and that's what I most respect about Harry Greb. So that has to be one of the toughest careers that any man could ever have. Great job by Harry Greb.
Yeah, fantastic breakdown, Scrapbook. And Random, can I add one thing there? Scrapbook's really touched my emotion strings on something. The sad story about Billy Misk from the end of his career, where, like Scrapbook said, he had that fight booked against a very dangerous opponent, and even though he was suffering, he was unwell, he had a lot of physical pain. Billy Misk went in there and put on a performance to earn that final payday just prior to Christmas, so he could have enough money to buy all his family everything to have a fantastic Christmas. He won the fight, he got the money, he had the fantastic Christmas, and within a week of New Year, he tragically passed away. You know, when I were reading that story back in the day, yeah, I were filling up. It were a horrible story, but he did it just to have that final memory with his family. But Billy Misk was an incredible fighter, and like Scrapbook says, you know, Mike Gibbons, you know, he was in, like Scrapbook says, that furore over, you know, Clabby, Darcy, Chip, you know, all these other fighters, Papke, you know, fighting for contendership to become the legitimate middleweight champion. But Mike Gibbons, back in 2015 to 2020, he were rated as one of the best fighters in the world by many people. You know, we're not talking about an average guy who was capable of joining the hall. We're talking about a guy who was so highly regarded amongst his time that many people thought he was one of the very best fighters in the world at that time, you know, and he had beaten Harry Greb back in 17 and he'd been unbeaten since. And Mike Gibbons' resume is star-studded with incredible wins showing how good he was. You know, Harry Greb beating him, and then like Scrapbook pointed out, Jerome Jeffords, people don't realize, you know, it's like one writer said, Jerome Jeffords is such a great middleweight that he could win a middleweight title in any era. He was good enough to win a middleweight title in pretty much any era. To me, he'd have a hard time winning a middleweight title in Monzon and Hagler's era, because to me, it's hard for any middleweight to beat those two. But you know what I mean? We're talking about a fighter in Jeff Smith who's more of a generational fighter. Whether the training types have changed, or you know, the rules have changed, the ring size has changed, he was just that good of a fighter that had he lived in any of those eras, he would have acquitted himself well and done really well. So Harry Greb is not only beating excellent fighters like me and Scrapbook have pointed out, he's beating some legitimate all-time greats and many legitimate Hall of Famers across multiple weights. It is absolutely crazy.
One last thing and I'm done. I'm sorry, Random.
Go right ahead, my friend.
Yeah, you know, what's really crazy about what BL just mentioned, it's really, really amazing with Jerome Jeffords, Jeff Smith. He was the Australian middleweight champion, and he never really got a full opportunity to get that shot. I mean, Harry Greb gave him opportunity after opportunity, but here's a man who was just that tough. And Harry Smith fought 3 fighters out of St. Paul. Mike Gibbons, he was in the ring with oh, excuse me, I think I'm having a, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, can hear loud and clear.
Okay, great. He was in there with the St. Paul Phantom, Mike Gibbons. He was in there with I don't know, my phone keeps tripping out.
Yeah, you're still coming through loud and clear, Scrapbook.
Okay, great. Yeah, he was in there with Mike Gibbons. And Mike Gibbons, as we said, was one of the toughest fighters during his era. And, you know, you really have to give him a lot of credit, because Mike Gibbons, in my opinion, could have been middleweight champion in any of those years. So you have to give him credit. He was in there with Billy Misk. Billy Misk was out of St. Paul as well. Billy Misk was, like I said, he was a very underrated fighter. At any given time, I believe he could have been a middleweight champion. So, you know, when you look at Harry Greb, when you look at the men that he was in there with, ring with, you really have to give him credit as one of the greatest fighters of all times. Like I said, I have him number 2, no question about it. Michael Dow was also out of St. Paul's, and he defeated Michael Dow. So these are the 3 St. Paul middleweights that he was in the ring with, and he did a great job with all of them.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
incredible fighter, incredible fighter. Yeah, the St. Paul Thunderbolt, Billy Misk. Yeah, excellent fighter. You know, and the one advantage of doing something like this, and I think what all of us are trying to stress to any listeners is that, you know, like fighters now, many of them will fight top level fighters. These guys also fought the top level fighters of their time. But to anyone out there, when you look at that list, and may I say, random acoustic thoughts, and I'm sure Scrapbook will back me on it, you have done a fantastic job over the Langford and Greb live streams to create these slides with pictures. You've made them very colourful. They're very, you know, entertaining to look at. You have done a fantastic job, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for all the hard work you've put in to these two live streams, creating these fantastic graphics and visuals. So I just want to say a big thank you for that. Yeah, it looks really amazing. As always, I'm sure Scrapbook will agree with me on that. It's a fantastic job. I do visuals, but I actually like your visuals. They're a bit more stand out than some of mine, you know, if I'm honest. So yeah, great job there. But yeah, Harry Greb. And another thing, you know, with Harry Greb, we tragically we never got to see, due to Les Darcy, with his well-documented problem when he was in America, where we tragically lost Les Darcy. We missed out on Darcy versus Greb. We never got Jimmy Clabby versus Harry Greb. We never got, obviously, the Michigan Assassin, that to me could have been one of the greatest middleweight fights of all time if the tragic Stanley Ketchel had not been murdered at 23 years old. Something Salvador Sanchez gets incredible romanticism about, but Stanley Ketchel gets very little regard about, being taken away at 23, I find. But Ketchel was in the ballpark that he probably, had he not been killed, we could have had Greb Ketchel, we could have had Greb Darcy, we could have had Greb Jimmy Clabby. There's many other fighters out there who were either taken from us or circumstances stopped it, that could have enhanced his career. Me personally, I'm sure Scrapbook will agree, a potential fight in 1916 to 17 against Stanley Ketchel against Harry Greb would have been a sensational war. Me personally, I'd go Harry Greb, but yeah, considering that he didn't fight some of those top level guys because they were tragically taken from us, what he did do was just sensational. I talk about him a lot because I'm so awestruck at what guys like him and Langford and other fighters do. It is awe-inspiring when you look at the careers. And when you understand them and understand what they did and who they're fighting, like Scrapbook greatly pointed out, you know, in terms of Billy Misk and Jeff Smith and Mike Gibbons, these guys were hard to beat fighters for anyone. They were hard to beat fighters for Tunney's. They were hard to beat fighters for Dempsey's. They were hard to beat fighters for everyone. But Greb seemed to have this ability where he could whip guys like Brennan and Meehan far more easily than what Dempsey could. And Dempsey was a heavyweight puncher, but Greb could whip them far more easily, of course. The spars between Greb and Dempsey, one where Dempsey hit Greb a bit low, so Harry Greb responded by headbutting him under his chin and causing a severe slice in Dempsey's tongue. Dempsey would actually, he had to put his fingers in his mouth when his glove were off to hold his tongue in place while he went to hospital. You know, Greb said, "Oh, you play that game? Here you go, take this." You know, added to his incredible career is his sensational will to win. You know, I'm just awestruck by this guy.
yeah, as are we all. So very quickly, folks, before I'm about to have to go fix a tire on the car so I can get to work. But I woke up. I work nights. I woke up right before we did this, so I'm about to have to go do that. But I just want to very quickly, just visually, because I did just slide for each year. So that's his debut year. A lot of 6-rounders. Pittsburgh, you could only fight 6-round, no decisions. You couldn't. So if he didn't stop the guy, goes to decision. Newspapermen score it. 15, he's picking up. 16, it's getting kind of crazy. But then leading up to the 1919 season, you know, 17 is insane.
Can I just add one quick point there? In 1917, from start of 1917 to end of 1919, Harry Greb had 104 fights, and he only lost 4 of them from over 100 fights. And when you look at the list of Hall of Famers that guy fought in those 3 years, to only have 4 defeats in over 100 fights is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you know, after 1919, he's done all this. He broke his hand. He still won 45 fights, but he is not done. He's still fighting a schedule that nobody today is maintaining and just keeps doing it. basically until right before he dies, tragically. I mean, it was tough narrowing it down, but I really do have to, unfortunately, I have to go address this tire issue. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everyone tuning in. Shout out to everyone in the chat. Shout out to everyone listening after the fact.
Can I just say a big thank you to Scrapbook Boxing? What a great thing it's been to have him as a counterfoil to myself, where I always learn from him as well. So yeah, it's been great to have him on board for this one, and hopefully we can do more of them on some topics. I'm already cooking another topic up potentially for 3 of us, what I'll talk to you guys about privately. But yeah, thank you for inviting us on Random Acoustic Thoughts. Means a lot. One of my favorite subjects.
This is a real pleasure, and thank you, Scrapbook, very much for everything, including this.
Thank you, Random, and thank you, BL. It's more than a pleasure, and look forward to another project. Thank you. I know you guys got to go. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. We appreciate you all. If you have any ideas for topics, you can slap them in the comments. No problem. Thanks again, guys, and take care, everybody.